Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our book event on Lessons from the Edge, the latest book from former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm acting director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and we are so pleased to have Ambassador Yovanovitch here today with us. I'm also pleased to start by introducing Grace Kennan-Warnke, who will begin with a brief introduction of the ambassador, and today's moderator, Michael Kimmage. Grace has a multifaceted career as an NGO leader, foundation executive, small business development expert, writer, and photographer. She was a senior scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2013, and among her other distinctions, she served as country director for Windrock International in Kiev, in Ukraine from 1999 to 2003. As well as the director of the Women's Economic Empowerment Project, funded by USAID. She was the founder and project supervisor of the Volkov International Small Business Incubator in Russia, and executive vice president of the Alliance of American Russian Women. She also holds the distinction of being a member of the Kennan Institute's Advisory Council. And we are so pleased to have Grace join us today. Grace? Please.
Let me just get rid of this.
I can take that. Okay.
Hello. So nice of all of you to come, and it's very nice to see a lot of familiar faces. It's a special honor to be here presenting Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who will be discussing her spectacular and brave new memoir, Lessons from the Edge. Masha and I first met in Moscow in the mid-90s when she was a junior officer in the political section of the U.S. Embassy. Ambassador Dick Miles, who is with us today, encouraged me to mentor her, but believe me, she didn't need it. Instead, a friendship bloomed. When Masha rather soon had her first ambassadorial post representing the United States in Kyrgyzstan, she invited me to visit. I accepted with alacrity and had a wonderful week exploring this faraway country and getting to know the ambassador's mother. And I was proud to be present when Masha was honored at the Marine Ball put on by the tiny Marine contingent stationed in Bishkek. I was also able to resume our friendship when Masha was deputy chief of mission in Kiev, and I was working there on women's economic empowerment issues. Later, it was an inspiration and honor to be invited as one of her 3 personal guests at the open congressional hearing held after she was summarily recalled from her post as ambassador to Ukraine. Masha gave a brilliant performance, both live and televised. Her articulation and courage are still remembered by so many and have made her the political heroine she is today. For me, however, her book had a special meaning. I remember vividly going to the theater in Boston when I was a student at Radcliffe and hearing a copy boy yelling, "Kennan kicked out of Moscow." That was how I learned that my father had just been expelled as ambassador by Joseph Stalin. But the real pain came later, when my father was forced to resign from the State Department because he was not reassigned within 3 months by John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State. The Yovanovitches and the Kennans share the pain of being forced to leave their revered State Department at the zenith of their careers. Masha's description brought the pain back again. Her book is not only a reminder of the past, but a possible augur of the future, and very much worth reading. It is with a great pleasure I present the author and friend, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. But before I do that, I'm also pleased to introduce today's moderator and my colleague on the Kennan Institute Advisory Council, Michael Kimmage. Michael Kimmage is a professor of history and the department chair at Catholic University of America and a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. From 2014 to 2017, He served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Michael, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Grace, for the very kind introduction or introductions. Thank you, Will, for hosting us. Thank you to the Kennan Institute for putting on this event. It's a joy to see not only people live and in the room, but all of the people in the plaza, a little bit like old times in the best sense of the word. And it's wonderful to have Ambassador Yovanovitch as a guest here among the first in-person and, of course, also virtual events. I can't quite say post-pandemic, but end phase, let's hope, of the pandemic. Before getting into the questions that I have, I just want to send out a reminder to our virtual audience, since we do have one, that if you'd like to ask a question in the course of this conversation, you can submit it using the chat feature located directly on the event page. You can do so via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, or you can send in a question through Twitter, hashtag Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please include your name and affiliation when asking questions, but I'm delighted to have the chance to ask a few of my own before we turn to our audience. And I wanted to begin, first of all, by just saying a few words about this remarkable book, Lessons from the Edge. It's a story of Ukraine, which is in all of our minds at the present moment. It's a story of Russia, which is also on our minds at the present moment. It's a story of diplomacy. It's also a story of immigration and family, and a story of education in many senses, teaching, learning, and passing on what was learned at the State Department. And in and around its ambiance, I'm quite convinced to future generations of American diplomats who will turn to this book for instruction and for insight, of course, into this period. So the book is a gift in many different respects. And first, would just like to thank you for the gift, but would then like to turn to the first of several questions. And I'm going to ask this question of you now about family and family background, but I'm going to return to it at the end of my questions and add a bit of a policy dimension to this particular question. But I wanted to ask first about if you could say a few words about your family background and connections both to Russia and to Eastern Europe and to the story of immigration, which is really, I think, where your book begins.
Yeah. Well, thank you. When I wrote this book, I really wanted to honor my parents who, as in many immigrant families, they sacrificed so much to come to this country, and they sacrificed a lot to give my brother and I all the advantages that we had. So my parents, my father was born in Chita in Siberia in the Soviet Union. Because he was half Serb, half Russian, his family was allowed to leave, and he grew up in what was then Yugoslavia. And he was taken prisoner by the Nazis, during World War II, escaped and spent the rest of World War II in France. My mother was also half Russian. Her father had fought with the White Army and fled the Soviet Union. And he ended up in Germany, married a German woman. They both promptly lost their citizenship and were stateless. And of course, the Nazis came. So this was not a very safe place to be stateless in Nazi Germany, sort of considered to be a Russian family. And so they both had experienced a lot of difficulties in their early years, and finally made their way to the United States. And my brother and I were raised in this bucolic, lovely town of Kent, Connecticut. You couldn't find a waspier place than this. And it was a lovely place to grow up. But my parents, were like so many immigrants. They worked hard. They wanted the best for us. They wanted to give us a good education because that was the ticket to success. And they were grateful for being in the United States, and they brought us up to be grateful. And sort of impressed upon us that we were lucky to be American, that we were lucky to grow up in the United States, and that we had to give back in some way, whatever way that was. And eventually, that became, joining the State Department and marrying up my interest in foreign affairs and history with the desire to give back.
There's a very nice review of your book in the New York Review of Books by Benjamin Nathans. It's sort of a group review, also books by Fiona Hill and Alexander Vindman, and really emphasizes the importance of immigration in all three books, and immigration as a backdrop to a certain strain of American diplomacy and in the culture of American national security. It's a rich theme, and it's so nice to read your book in that context. I wanted to ask now, sort of moving along chronologically, about your earlier diplomatic experiences in Africa, in Kyrgyzstan, in Armenia, in Russia, and if you could just reflect on what it was like to serve in these initial roles. And one of the themes of your book is what it was like to be a part of a pioneering generation of American women, first of all at Princeton University, where I believe it's 1975 that Princeton became co-ed, but it's, I think, certainly in the 1970s. And as I read your book, you enter a foreign service, you enter a U.S. Department of State that's not fully prepared for this transition from an all-male world to one in which men and women are equal. So if you would want to fold that subject into these reflections, this might be a nice place to do so.
Yeah, so I had been living in Manhattan, before I joined the Foreign Service. I didn't know how to drive, because I didn't need to, because there were taxis everywhere. And I joined the Foreign Service, and I had this spirit of adventure. I had no idea what I was entering into, and I thought, well, I'm going to do something totally different. And Somalia was on the list, and Somalia is where I decided to go for a number of different reasons, but also for the adventure of it. I'd never been to Africa. I wanted to see what that was like. And so I ended up there as one of many administrative officers. Embassies, as some of you probably know, are like little cities, especially in places where there aren't a lot of services, where the economy doesn't work. And so the embassy has to provide its own water supply, its own, get its own diesel, and there's a little gas station there for gassing up vehicles. We need to do all of that for ourselves, and those were among my responsibilities. And in a place like Somalia in the 1980s, that was not an easy task, and it was rife with corruption, just rife with corruption, both on the small scale, a little bit here, a little bit there, but also on the grand scale with Siad Barre, the president, basically looting the treasury and sharing a little bit of it with his favored clan members. And so, how do you get things done in that kind of an environment? And that was a real challenge for me and a real eye-opener in terms of what parts of the world could be like and what I needed to do in order to, follow the rules, follow U.S. law, but also get things done. It was a real challenge. And in Somalia, there was one other woman one other American at the embassy. Everybody who worked for me was male. Everybody else, all the Americans, were male. And in Muslim societies, often what happens is women, at least at that time, women are treated as sort of a third gender. So I wasn't male, but I also, couldn't be treated as a female because I was in charge. And so at least of my little part of the embassy. So the guys who worked for me came up with a name for me, which was Mr. Mosh. Masha being my first name, and Mr. being, the honorific, because clearly I couldn't be a Miss or a Mrs. because I was in a man's job. So it was, it was little things like that and bigger things like that. When you would go to somebody's house, which didn't happen very often, where did I belong? Should I be in the kitchen helping prepare the food and eating with the women, or should I be with the men, who had invited us and speaking policy and not really policy, but speaking about business and other things. And so that was, that was a real kind of a learning curve for me, and there wasn't a lot of guidance. And in fairness, I didn't seek a lot of guidance because I wasn't sure that anybody else really knew what that was like, at least at that particular embassy, since there weren't any other women except for one also very junior person.
Let's move now to Ukraine, and I wanted to ask. I have two questions about Ukraine, but I want to ask the first about reform and anti-corruption, and that was an enormous effort on the part of the U.S. government that really begins in 2014, which is to support the best elements of the Maidan revolution and to encourage. I think it's really rule of law is the major challenge. And it was very much a work in progress in the years that you were the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And there are many, many interesting passages in your book about successes and a few setbacks when it came to encouraging the spirit of reform in Ukraine. So I wanted to ask about that, the sort of core agendas and the experiences in that regard.
Yeah. So I, just to backtrack a little bit, I always feel that, and I'm probably biased, that Ukraine gets a little bit of a bad rap in terms of its reputation. I mean, before February 24th, if people generally in America thought about Ukraine, often what they would say is corruption, because that is what we discussed in policy circles and more generally when we talked about Ukraine recently. And I actually think that that's a little bit unfair, because the reason that we put those two words in the same sentence is because the Ukrainian people said, we don't want to live in a country that is corrupt. We want to live in to use your word, and it's exactly what the Ukrainian people said, we want to live in a country where there is rule of law, where the president is under the same rules as everybody else, and where he is she is accountable for their actions, and if they steal, they too need to be held to account. And the Ukrainians, I think, have tried since independence to sort of move the country in that direction various times. 2004, the Orange Revolution, and then in 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity. And that phrase, the Revolution of Dignity, really means rule of law. That I want to be treated with the dignity that the president is treated. I want to be treated the same. And the Ukrainian people, took to this. It started with a bunch of students who were very disappointed and angry when President Yanukovych decided he was not going to seek a closer association with the EU. And that was in November of 2013. And there was a little protest on the square, and Yanukovych, being Yanukovych, cracked down. And a journalist, Mustafa Nayem, who some of you may know, put out a Facebook post and said, let's go out and support our students. This is an outrage. Because the students, when Yanukovych said he didn't want the closer association with the EU, they saw their futures flash in front of their eyes. They were worried that they wouldn't be able to study in the EU, that they wouldn't be able to have that easy back and forth, whether it was visits or immigration or trade and transportation. All these really critical things that all of a sudden were hanging in the balance. And so the Mustafa Nayem's call to support the students was very effective because, first there were a couple people who supported them, and then over time it became hundreds of thousands, and on occasion perhaps even 1 million people that were out there on the square, and they were successful, and they managed to chase Yanukovych out of the country with approximately $40 billion worth of loot. So I think that the agenda then became from civil society, activists in civil society, but very much supported by the people, as well as in the government. There were reformers in the government, and Poroshenko, President Poroshenko, whether he was a reformer at that point or not, he knew that there had to be reform, and he needed a strong anti-corruption agenda. And so that really is where it came from. It was reformers in society, it was reformers in the government, and it was the international community working together to support these goals of anti-corruption and reform. Yeah.
I was struck reading your book that one of the most significant things in the background of our current moment is really the election in 2019. Of course, that's at the end of your time as U.S. ambassador, but it was important at the time, and you document the significance of a free election and a reformist, or at least independent-minded candidate, non-oligarch candidate, Volodymyr Zelensky, winning the election. But the kind of legitimacy that he won with that free election is, I think, being demonstrated to the world as we speak. So that's not anything I could have thought of in 2019, that it would unfold in the way that it did, but I can't think really of a more consequential European election, maybe in the last 20 or 30 years, than that particular election, and speaks to all of the issues that you're describing with the Maidan and its aftermath. Now I want to turn to the dramatic moment in which your book begins, and to which Grace alluded at the beginning of our conversation today. And this is a collision of sorts between corruption Ukrainian style, and how does one describe it in the U.S., sort of, suppose we could just say corruption American style, that these two forces collided at a certain point and very unexpectedly collided over the very office that you were holding in Kiev, and this led, among other events and stories, led eventually to the first impeachment of President Donald Trump. I wanted to ask you just for your thoughts about this. It's clearly at the heart of the book and is a very important personal story, but it's also an important national story. I wanted to ask you, first of all, your thoughts, and then I have a kind of secondary question that I wanted to add into this, and it's just what it's like to be a U.S. diplomat and to be in the public eye in the United States. I know that you had become accustomed to being in the public eye in Ukraine, and that's part of your job and your responsibility when you're an ambassador, but you don't expect to become a national news story in your home country. So I just wanted to ask for your thoughts and reflections on this part of the story.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was very otherworldly what happened to me in 2019 and as in my last months in Ukraine. And, I'm still processing it and still finding out information about what happened, various players, various things that were going on in that time. And I think we're probably going to continue to find out more things over time as more books, more research, more books are published, more research is done. But it was, for me, obviously, it was, profoundly distressing. I mean, it was devastating. But the bigger story, really, is that when an American ambassador is yanked out of her position because she's following U.S. policy, that's a real problem. And it kind of left a lot of people wondering what was going on. And, there were a number of ambassadors who are also doing hard things around the world, in the name of the American people, following our U.S. policy, implementing that policy, and, making people mad. Sometimes in their host country, sometimes elsewhere, sometimes in the U.S., because there are big interests that are often at stake when we pursue certain policies, whatever they might be. But the point is that if ambassadors are doing their job and implementing the policy, they should be supported, first and foremost by the State Department, but secondly by the U.S. government. And that's not what happened. And so it left a lot of people wondering, U.S. ambassadors wondering how hard should they be pushing? Were they going to be supported or not? It left, autocratic and other regimes thinking, oh, we too can strike a deal. If we don't like a particular policy, if we don't like a particular individual, we can figure out a way to make sure it goes away. And even our friends and allies wondering, is this nice ambassador sitting opposite me, is this person really representing the administration? So it really, I think, that period in the spring of 2019 when I was being removed and, kind of my reputation kind of destroyed, I think it really had a much bigger impact than just the effect on me personally. And I think that is the thing that we need to focus on.
That's very illuminating, and these are remarkable passages in the book, for sure, to see what it looks like from this story. I think that we all encountered in the national news media, to see what it looks like from within is a very remarkable aspect of this book. Well, I had a question about the war, but I'm gonna skip over that for purposes of time and ask my final question. I trust our audience to ask a question about the war if it's of interest to them, or I can circle back to it. But I have a final question about the conclusion of your book, and I loved a sentence from your conclusion, which you wrote: "At its core, diplomacy is an optimistic profession." And it's nice to go through a book which has material in it of the kind that you've just been describing, which is troubling, and to arrive at that sentence. And so I wanted to ask about optimism, but I also wanted to ask about it in regard to one particular piece of the policy puzzle at the present moment, and this is the huge Russian diaspora that the war has generated. And I wanted to ask about it because of the story that you told about your parents being the products of a much earlier diaspora from Russia or from the Soviet Union, from that part of the world. When you see that their child could grow up to become a U.S. ambassador, that's in a sense cause for optimism in and of itself. But are there ways in which we could approach perhaps this diaspora population and see if we couldn't look at them in the spirit of optimism? Obviously, you look at the war and sort of pessimism might be the first thing that comes to mind. But my concluding question is about optimism and where we might find it at the present moment.
Yeah. Well, I think, Colin Powell used to have this expression where he said optimism is a force multiplier. And that is something that I very much took to heart, because I think, if you go into something, whatever it is, a school project, a diplomatic initiative, thinking you're going to fail, chances are really high you're going to fail. I mean, at least give yourself the support of optimism that it is possible to do this. It may not be possible now, because in diplomacy, like in every other, I think, part of life, diplomacy is basically relationships between individuals and countries. It's all about timing. And so an initiative may be very ripe in 5 years. It's just not ready at the particular time that you're in that country. But what you're doing is you're laying the groundwork for, hopefully a breakthrough that will come in 5 years, perhaps in 20 years. Because, while all of us, are hoping that we will birth Middle East peace, it's probably unlikely that it's going to happen on your watch. And so what are the things that you can do around that to lay the groundwork for a breakthrough later? Another famous Secretary of State Schultz, used to talk about tending the garden, that our work is often not dramatic, it's often not very sexy and the things that people might imagine. It's the day-to-day work of tending a garden, of planting the seeds, putting in the mulch, taking out those noxious weeds so that the initiative can grow and survive and thrive. It's fertilizing everything, and just every day tending the garden. And that garden, those are our relationships with allies and partners around the world. We need to put in the work every day. And first and foremost, our embassies are on the front line doing that. Although obviously we require assists from secretaries of state and presidents and others. But it's important that we do that daily work so that when there is a crisis or when there is a need, we have those relationships. They are already strong and thriving, and we can count on other countries to do whatever it is we are hoping that they will do. So I think tending the garden is really important work. But going back to being optimistic, I mean, I think right now I look at Ukraine and I think one can certainly see the glass half full there, right? Mm. But think about where we were on February 24th, where I think, I bet if we did a poll of this room, many of the people in this room thought that it would be a cakewalk to Kyiv and the Russians would win completely. And that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the Ukrainian people are a free people. They are actually a distinct people with a distinct country that has a right to exist. And they fought for their country, and they fought for their families, and they fought for their freedom. And that gives me optimism. And I can see that, around the world, and I can see it in the United States too, especially when I work with young people. I think, whenever we all who are, I don't want to say older, but more mature, I think one can, start getting very pessimistic. But when you talk to young people who are, ready to do, take on all the battles, it's very, very affirming.
Well, thank you so much for that, and that's the run of my questions. Let me just give a brief prompt again to the virtual audience to send in questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org or Twitter @KennanInstitute or at the Facebook page, but I'm glad to see that there are already a couple of very interesting questions that have come in. And the first is so timely that the first question has to be asked first. What advice would you give to Ambassador-designate Bridget Brink? How can she or we limit the damage U.S. domestic turmoil may cause to the U.S. Ukraine relationship? And this question comes from Stephen Engelken.
Okay, well, thanks for that question. I know Bridget Brink very well. I've worked with her closely, and she's going to do a fabulous job, and I don't think she needs any advice from me. She is very well qualified for this job and has worked off and on in the region for her entire career. In Europe and off and on in the former Soviet Union. And we worked most closely together when she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary, in other words, the chief, the day-to-day policy person in Washington on Ukraine, and I was the ambassador. And so, daily phone calls, emails back and forth, and she, I think she's going to jump right in and do a great job.
All right, another question from Pinal Patel. What do you see as the future of women's leadership in Ukraine?
Well, I think it is very rosy because, women in Ukraine have been leading the way, for the last 30 years, and I think they're going to continue to do it. If you look at the parliament, if you look in business, if you look in civil society and in other parts of Ukraine, women are very strong and are leading the way. And I think that will continue because I think one of the issues for girls coming up, women coming up, is there a role model? And if there isn't a role model, I was fortunate that I had a number of male, I don't want to say formal mentors, but people who were looking out for me, people who gave me opportunities to show what I could do and who promoted me and moved me forward. I think sometimes, though, you're looking for, who's that person who looks like you and gives you that ability to imagine that you, too, could be in that space. This is not completely on topic, but I just have to share with you that in about the second year when I was ambassador in Ukraine, one of the family members came up to me and said that her son had come up to her and asked whether boys could be ambassadors too. So I think that says it all.
It's a tough question, right? From Angie M., a graduate student. In your expert opinion, and considering recent events in Ukraine, does Putin have a coherent foreign policy strategy, or is this at best improvisation?
Yeah, that's a dark place. I can't get too optimistic when I think about what's going on in Putin's head. I think, in the beginning, pre February 24th, I think he probably thought it was a very well laid out foreign policy, bolstered by and buttressed by his views of history, which are not entirely, completely not accurate. And so I think from his point of view, I think it was entirely reasonable and rational and coherent. But if, the American military has this expression that war plans fall apart at the first contact with the enemy. And that is exactly what happened, I think, with the Russian military and Putin's plans, his strategic plans. This was going to be the way that he would, not only incorporate Ukraine into Russia immediately, very quickly. It was going to be the way that he would sow divisions and doubts in Europe and in NATO in the transatlantic alliance. And none of that came to pass. In fact, the opposite happened. So it's hard, to see it now as something that is very coherent and successful.
This question from Stephen Keenan, how can the U.S. best raise money that will be needed to rebuild Ukraine after its victory?
I like the way that question is posed. So there are a lot of people who are thinking about this right now, and I think there are many different elements of what that Marshall Plan for Ukraine would look like. I think one of the areas that I at least would like to see us examine is the money, the billions of dollars that have been frozen in Russian assets. So I've been told by lawyers that it would be very difficult to just take that money and say, this is $400 billion that's in the U.S., this will go to Ukrainian reconstruction. Apparently you can't do that. But depending on how the war ends, I could see a scenario where Russia would volunteer to do something like that.
That actually leads very naturally to our next question, and we'll take one from the live audience in just a moment. This is from Jennifer Brush, former OSCE ambassador to Moldova.
Hi, Jennifer.
Ambassador Yovanovitch, you continue to inspire. Thank you for your service and example. This is a tough question that she's asking. If Putin has destroyed the liberal world order put in place after World War II, what new world order can we or should we establish in its place? And in that new world order, what role would Russia play? It's a very large question.
Yeah, it's a large question, and it's an important question, and I think it is the question we need to be asking, actually, because while I do believe that Putin's war of choice against Ukraine is about Ukraine and his obsession with, at least for the time being, incorporating Ukraine into Russia, but I think he has broader goals. He's told us that, and if you look at what he's done over time, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, and now Ukraine again in 2022. I mean, I take him at his word that he wants to take on more of the former republics into Russia. But I think it's also about what kind of a world we're going to be living in, because the Russian model doesn't work. It just doesn't work. If you look at democracies around the world, and market economies around the world, those systems are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I think nobody would say that. But they have delivered better results for more people over time than the current model, whatever one wants to call it, in Russia. Putin can't compete, and so he uses the instrument of war. He is a bully. He disrupts and divides. He uses all of the techniques we've seen from the Soviets, plus a couple of new ones like cyber, and that's very, very damaging. And I don't think we have really figured out a way to wrap our minds around what the problem set is, much less what the solution set is, because many of these things are kind of under the threshold of what we consider to be war. Although perhaps that definition will change as well. And so I think we need to think hard about what the challenges are that we are facing today, not just from Russia, but the environment, cyber, privacy issues, I mean, on and on and on. The list goes on of things that we are very concerned about today that we didn't even conceive of 50 years ago or 70 years ago when the world order was established after World War II. And so I think we need to think about what those challenges are, and I think we need to look at the institutions we have now. How do they need to be reformed? And perhaps there are new institutions that need to be created. What is the role of Russia in all of this? That's a good question, and it depends on how this war ends. and it depends on how Russia behaves. And, you know, I kind of came up in the diplomatic service in the late, in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And I think the belief then was, and to a certain extent I still have this, because again, I am an optimist, that if you include countries in the family of nations, and if you give them opportunities, that they will understand that the international order works for them too. I don't think that we have convinced Russia of this, certainly not given Putin's actions. There are other questions about other countries out there as well. And so I think we need to really think hard about how we include countries and how we move forward, because this is going to be, I think, the defining issue of this period of time. And it's going to be how history remembers this era, in my view.
We'll just say for readers of the book that the epilogue has a number of very interesting suggestions about how to frame U.S. foreign policy more generally. So that's a thread to pick up from the book in answer to this very rich question from our live audience.
Yes, Ambassador.
If you could just, yeah.
I'm a Wilson Fellow right now, and I'm a former NPR Moscow correspondent who covered Ukraine a lot. I'd just like to jump off a remark that Michael said. In hindsight, it looks like the 2019 election in Ukraine was truly momentous, and the election of Zelensky. And I'm curious, what interactions you had, maybe personally with Zelensky or with his team, that maybe foreshadowed his future role, or are you also surprised in how he's managed to rally, well, not only his own country, but
The world.
the whole world behind him?
Yeah. So I knew him before he declared his candidacy and as a candidate. By the time when he was elected president, I was ordered home 3 days later. So I didn't actually deal with him as president. And he was, in our first meeting, I was expecting this really funny, comedian, a funny guy to walk into the room, and he was funny, but he was at great pains to explain that he was a businessman, that he had established Kvartal, this media conglomerate, a multi-million-dollar conglomerate, and he had done that through his talent and his hard work and his business acumen. He was very proud of that, and he wanted us to understand that he had those skills. So it was, that was kind of interesting, because that's not what I was expecting. And then fast forward to, kind of the late winter, early spring of 2019, where it was obvious to us, and perhaps sometimes it's easier for outsiders to see what is going on. It was obvious to us that Zelensky was going to win. I think to the Kyiv elite, who, they all knew Zelensky because he did stand up at their fancy parties and things like that. They couldn't believe that, the comedian was actually going to win, that life would imitate art in this way. And, there was, real mourning when he won. I mean, there was shock and mourning and concern about what would happen. I left at that point, but watching it from far, far away, I think he had a strong start with a very good pro-reform government, and then life intervenes, and it became harder and harder, I think, for Zelensky to keep his promises of ending corruption and moving forward on reform, and so he was kind of struggling and losing popularity by February of 2022, and you may recall that he was going after political enemies at that point, having Poroshenko arrested and so forth, and then the war happened, and did I predict that he was going to step up in such a way? I wouldn't necessarily have seen it, but he has, And I think that the Ukrainian people clearly knew what they were doing when they voted him in with 73% of the vote. I mean, he reflects the Ukrainian people, he unites the Ukrainian people, he inspires them, and I think he inspires the world. I mean, I think it's remarkable.
Well, we have many more questions than we have time to pose and to answer them, so I'll do my best to get through as many as we can. This from Patrick Imbert at the University of Ottawa. When you were removed from your position, did you get any kind of support from other ambassadors, for instance, ambassadors from European or Canadian countries, or from European countries or from Canada?
Well, I'll interpret what support means. I mean, obviously not officially, but you know, when you serve overseas with people, particularly in hard places, I mean, you become quite friendly with your counterparts. And so, yes, I got a lot of support from those who I was friendly with.
What would be your advice, this question asked by Elizabeth Cooper, staff assistant in Senator Tammy Baldwin's office, what would be your advice for junior professionals wanting to break into the foreign policy sphere?
Well, I guess it kind of depends in what direction one wants to go. I mean, there's obviously many places in the U.S. government that one can apply for jobs. There's also, you know, think tanks, universities that are also, you know, great places to pursue those kinds of interests. But I think, you know, the best advice is to get really good at what you do, you know, whatever your area is. Most people can't be expert in every part of the world, so, you know, pick your passion and focus on that, and perhaps learn a language. I think that, you know, language and culture is such an important part of understanding what is happening in a country, and that also really adds to your expertise.
This question from Jacopo De Marinas, research intern at the Millennium Project. Do you believe a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine is still possible? If so, what type or approach to diplomacy do you feel is needed to support a peaceful settlement of the conflict? Another tough question.
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is yes. Eventually, this war will end. I don't know when. You know, I don't have a crystal ball, but it will end, and there will be some sort of negotiated settlement. And I don't know what the contours of that settlement will look like, because that's really going to be determined by facts on the ground. And I think, you know, we in the West, and particularly we in the United States, should not be dictating. People often ask, you know, should Ukraine give up Crimea? Should it give up the Donbass? Should it do this? Should it do that? I think that's up to the Ukrainian people to decide. They are the ones who are fighting, and I think they get to decide what the contours of a diplomatic solution looks like at the end. That said, I would also say that it's my own belief that, and I think it's a belief of many who know Ukraine and know Ukrainians, that there will be, that the Ukrainians will prevail. There may be a time when Russia prevails militarily, but the Ukrainians will not, I think, tolerate an invader in their country. And there will be a guerrilla war, and it will be ugly, and the Ukrainians will pay in blood, but so will the Russians. And ultimately, I think the Ukrainians will prevail.
Well, this question follows perfectly on the heels of your answer. This from Jeff Leibowitz, retired strategic planning. From where do the Ukrainians obtain the resourcefulness, intelligence, and organization to prosecute their defense against the Russian hordes? Not the Mongol hordes in this case, the Russian hordes.
So I think a lot of it is just inherent. I mean, Ukrainians are, you know, they love freedom, they are unruly, they don't like it when we tell them what to do, they certainly don't like it when the Russians tell them what to do, and they won't stand for it. And they are brought up in that tradition. The poet laureate of the country, the most famous poet, he had a saying that, "Fight on and you will prevail." That's one of his most famous lines in his poetry. And Ukrainian school children are brought up on this. So I think it just comes naturally. The other thing I would say is that, you know, since independence in 1991, but especially since 2014, The U.S. and several other countries have really worked hard with the Ukrainian military, both in terms of the reforms that they needed to take on to make their military more efficient, and you know, not only the organization, but things like acquisition, which can always be a very difficult area. Things like setting up an NCO corps, where we can see the Russians that don't have a non-commissioned officer corps, they've got their generals going to the front line, and I think they're up to 9 generals dead now. I mean, it's inconceivable, really. The Ukrainians, you know, at the time when I was there, I was like, God, they're not reforming fast enough. But actually, a lot of those reforms did take, they did take them on, and I think we are seeing the results. That, and frankly, you know, the training and equip program that we've had for years, but especially since 2014, that trained up Ukrainian soldiers, equipped Ukrainian soldiers. You know, in hindsight, I wish we had equipped them even more, but we are doing that at a great rate now, and it needs to keep on going. And I think that, combined with the fact that this is an existential fight. The Ukrainians know why they are fighting, and that is true for soldiers on the battlefield. It is true for the territorial defense forces. It is true for, you know, all of my friends who are, you know, doing one thing or another, whether it is driving an ambulance, whether it's being in a ministry and making sure those trains are running on time so that supplies come in and people can go out. Whatever it is, they are motivated. They know what they're doing, and I don't think the Russian soldiers do.
I mean, you had mentioned the word corruption being associated with Ukraine. I think one thing military analysts did too little of was to associate corruption with the Russian military.
Yes.
Because you can see that a lot of the funds were siphoned off, and that's played a big role on the battlefield. So to me, it's an interesting analytical point. Well, this question kind of goes in the same direction in terms of the question of support for Ukraine prior to the war that began on February 24th. And this is from Eva Weidemann, retired foreign language teacher. What would have been necessary to end the occupation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine earlier? Could Europe have been more supportive for Ukrainians in the stretch of 8 years? I assume 8 years, sort of between 2014 and 2022.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I mean, I think that not even with hindsight, we the West should have been tougher with Russia, because, you know, the pattern has been that, I mean, there was the Chechen wars, the 2 Chechen wars, where, you know, I think we protested, but not very strongly. Then Georgia in 2008, where we protested, but, you know, there weren't even any sanctions imposed. And there was, as far as I know, very little diplomatic cost to Russia. Then 2014, where Russia illegally annexed Crimea, I mean, within days, and then and invaded the Donbass for good measure. And there we did impose sanctions. We did kick Russia out of the G8. We did a number of things. We should have done more, because I think Putin was not sufficiently punished or deterred, or whatever the right verb is. He could withstand that. And so, you know, I think he thought that, you know, coming up to 2022, that the West was weak, it would not be united, and it would not push back, and maybe there'd be a couple more sanctions. I don't think he saw the ferocity of these sanctions, the effect it would have on the Russian economy and the Russian people, and that it will have, because I think the real impact we haven't seen yet. So, yeah, I mean, I think we should have done more.
Okay, from Charles L. Berry, did providing visible support to Maidan protesters in late 2013 send the wrong signal if the U.S. would protect them potentially with military support as they pursued the removal of Yanukovych, support which the United States was never disposed to give?
This was before my time in Ukraine, but I'm not aware that we sent signals that we would provide military support or police support to the protesters on the square. or did I misunderstand the question?
I think you understood it perfectly. I think it's good to move on to the next one. This from Lydia Voronina, retired writer-editor at the U.S. Department of State. How successful was Zelensky in fighting corruption, I assume, sort of before the war began, that stretch of time?
Yeah. Well, I think, he had some successes, and he had some setbacks, including some of the things that we had moved forward on while I was there. There were steps back. But I think that is often the way it is with reforms, particularly really difficult ones, that progress is not in a straight line. You move forward, you move to the side, you move over here, you move backwards, and then maybe you take 2 steps forward. It's all about the timing and where the opportunities are. But I think that, in February of 2022, looking at his agenda, he was an inexperienced president that was struggling a little bit and looking forward to Ukrainian elections in 2024 and, kind of wondering how he could consolidate his successes enough in order to win again. Now, of course, that was before, February 23rd was one world, February 24th another.
Now, you've already gotten many tough questions, and so this will be the last concluding question. It's tough not only because it's very difficult to answer, but also because it's hypothetical. So,
well, we're trained about hypotheticals.
Trained about hypotheticals to deal with them. So, if you could answer the question, then if you have any sort of closing thoughts, this is a perfect occasion to provide them to our in-person and virtual audience, and then we will begin to conclude this event. But the final question from Larry Chasteen, professor at the University of Texas at Dallas. Do you think Vladimir Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Trump had been president?
So, yeah, that is definitely a hypothetical question. So let me not give one complete answer to this question, but a couple of different thoughts. My own view is that Vladimir Putin was getting a lot of what he wanted from Donald Trump. It was clear that President Trump was not enamored of NATO, that he felt NATO was taking advantage of us, and he wanted that to end. And there are any number of senior advisors around President Trump who have said publicly that had he, here's another hypothetical, had he won a second term, he would have pulled the U.S. out of NATO. Imagine what that would have done, in terms of our position in Europe, in terms of, so many different things. The most successful defensive alliance in the world, the most important country withdraws, it would collapse. And I think that's one of the things that Putin wants. He wants a collapse of NATO and, hopefully the EU. He wants divisions in Europe so that he can profit from those divisions. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that Putin, while I think our official U.S. policy during the Trump administration was relatively strong, it was basically a continuation of the Obama policy, and President Trump added he enabled us to transfer javelins in 2018 to Ukraine. That had not been done in the Obama administration. So that was a strengthening, I think, of our policy. More important symbolically than defensively at that point, but important. But despite that, there were little hints all along the way that President Trump had other thoughts about Ukraine and other thoughts about Russia. He clearly admired Putin and admired Russia. He clearly felt that Ukraine was the weaker partner, that Crimea was Russian because they speak Russian there. Various other things that he has said repeatedly over time. And so I think that sent a signal to Putin. And in November of 2018, when the Russians expanded the war in the Donbass, to the naval domain. And they had ships up in the Sea of Azov, which is that little part of a little sea that kind of continues on from the Black Sea and is encircled by Ukraine and Russia. They had vessels up there, and those vessels came down and attacked 3 Ukrainian vessels. And there was a standoff over a number of hours. I mean, these things don't happen like that. And I happened to actually be in Washington, lots of phone calls back and forth, to the Ukrainian government, to here, to there. And, we wanted in the first instance, I would say, the embassy, the State Department, that there be an official statement issued from the NSC, from the Secretary of State, from the President, ideally, from somebody saying, this cannot stand, and, we call on Russia to stop and to release the vessels and release the sailors. But President Trump didn't want to do that. And so, I often wonder whether that was another signal of Trump's true views about Ukraine, Russia, and what was happening there. And then, so this was at the end of November. In December, we were sending some American vessels into the Black Sea to show the flag, to indicate to all who were paying attention, especially Russia, that freedom of commerce, the right to navigation and all of that is important, and that the U.S. will continue to stand for that, to uphold this. And after it was publicly announced, the president canceled it because he didn't want to upset Russia. So I think that Putin was getting a lot of what he needed already from President Trump, and why use the instrument of war if you don't have to, if you're getting enough of what you need. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine, the U.S., Europe were better off in any way at all. And I do wonder whether at the end of the day, if Putin, who is very patient, whether he would have used force to annex all of Ukraine if he hadn't been able to sort of nibble away at all of the edges in the ways that I've described that eventually, a puppet government just kind of exceeded. This is a hypothetical, and I'm going way out on a limb, but I don't think that we would have been better off.
Well, if anybody asks a hypothetical question, they can't be surprised by a hypothetical answer. Thank you so much to all of you in our live audience for joining you today. Most of all, thank you, and also to our virtual audience. Most of all, thank you to Ambassador Yovanovitch. This is the book. For those who are here in person, you can purchase the book outside after the event. This is especially with our virtual sort of listeners and viewers in mind. Please visit our website if you'd like to stay up to date with upcoming events and publications, as well as our podcasts, Canon X and the Russia File. You can find our latest analysis of events in Ukraine, Russia, and the region in our Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs. And you can also find all of the Wilson Center's Ukraine coverage in one place on the Hindsight Up Front Ukraine collection page. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody else,
thank you to the Canon
for coming and for your
Institute.
questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for coming.